Well, good morning. A few years ago, I was teaching in Texas, and whilst out there and driving around, I was particularly struck by one road sign that was different there than the one that we have here in England. And it was the road sign that says, yield. In England, we have the ever so polite equivalent, which is give way. But I liked yield, and in fact, I mentioned it in a sermon. And a few weeks later, someone sent this to me. Fantastic, isn't it? Now, the word yield comes from an old English word, gilden, and it refers to a payment or an offering or worship. In our modern use, the word yield conveys two meanings. It means to give up or to harvest. And I think it's a fundamental Christian word and fundamental Christian response to God in the Christian life. What we yield to Jesus is an act of worship, of offering, of giving of worth to the one that we believe to be all worthy. And when we yield, we receive a harvest back from God, a reward. Jesus said, you reap what you sow. You yield from God when you yield to God. However, there are some times when we certainly must not yield. Here we have it. And I want to say this morning, never yield to sin. Never yield to sin. In Romans 6 and verse 13, it says this, do not yield your bodies to sin, but do yield yourself to God. The Oxford wit, Oscar Wilde, said, the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Funny, but not true. Bad advice. It's like telling an alcoholic to stop drinking by drinking. And in the Bible, we see numerous of God's people who, unfortunately, instead of yielding to God, yielded to sin. They gave into it. Adam and Eve yielded to desire, and all the world's ills are laid at their feet. Cain yielded to jealousy, and it cost him the scorn of ages. Noah yielded to alcohol, and it cost him his honor. Moses yielded to pride and forfeited entering the land. Gideon yielded to entitlement and the desire for gold, and it lost him all the ground that he'd won. Saul yielded to pride and forfeited the kingdom. David yielded to laziness and then lust. Israel yielded to idolatry and they were exiled. Judas yielded to greed and it cost him eternal scorn. The disciples yielded to fear and they betrayed and abandoned Jesus. In the New Testament we read of Demas, who yielded to the world and abandoned Paul's mission. One of my greatest sadnesses in ministry is to see so many friends and heroes who have yielded to the wrong thing. Rather than yielding themselves up to God, they've yielded to their own flesh, to temptation, to sin. And it's cost them their job, or their homes, their marriages, their reputation. I've seen friends yield on doctrine and give up the gospel just to be culturally relevant, giving up fundamental biblical truths and bending to cultural relativism. Truths that once upon a time they would almost have died for, but they've let just dribble away. In life, there are numerous pressures on us to yield to the wrong thing, to sin, the flesh, cultural pressures, things that want to control you, conform you, push you around, make you march to the beat of their drum, to dominate you and ultimately diminish you. Winston Churchill in a famous conclusion to the speech that he gave at his old school Harrow in autumn 1941, just after we'd come through the Battle of Britain. He said this: "Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honour and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy." What a speech. What a man. In the Bond movie Skyfall, Judi Dench, she's fantastic, plays M, and she's before the Parliamentary Committee defending MI6 policy and action against terrorism. And she quotes Tennyson's poem: "We are not now that strength which in old days moved heaven and earth. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." The irony is that in Tennyson's poem about Ulysses, Ulysses doesn't seek and find and strive. Ulysses has yielded. He's given in and he's given up. And the poem ends with him looking at the sea longingly, but not going out on it. Many of us don't want to yield to sin, but we just don't want to bother standing against it. Many of us don't really want to yield to pressures around us that go against God and His gospel, but we can't be bothered standing and fighting either. And I want to ask this morning, is there any area of your life where you know that you may have given in, given up, yielded to something that you should never have done? Well, thank God for forgiveness if you have come to Him today and ask Him to forgive you. And if you're finding yourself in a place of temptation and struggle over this, then no surrender. Never give up. Do not yield. Do not yield.